Welcome to a new episode of Coptic Civilization. I'm Mikhail Saad. Our topic today is about the Copts in the Middle Ages. That's from about the year 600 AD to 900 AD. The occasion is the appearance of a new excellent book entitled From Byzantine to Islamic Egypt, Religion, Identity, and Politics after the Arab Conquest. The author is Deacon Severus Mikhail from Los Angeles, Deacon with the Coptic Orthodox Church in Los Angeles, academically known as Maged S.A. Mikhail, Associate Professor of History at California State University in Fullerton, California. Welcome, Deacon Severus.
Thank you, Dr. Saad. Pleasure to be with you.
I'm honored that you kindly accepted my invitation to appear on our program. You enriched us before in two earlier episodes.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind. It's my pleasure.
And I always enjoy reading your books. I enjoyed reading parts of this book because it's over 400 pages, so it will take me a while to complete it. But also I enjoyed reading your earlier book, co-authored with Dr. Tim Vivian under the title The Holy Workshop of Virtue, The Life of John the Little by Zacharias of Sacha.
Thank you.
And we had an earlier episode for Coptic Civilization about this book.
Yes.
And that comes from, actually, you had passion for St. John the Little. I know you participated in excavation, a team from America to the remains or the archaeological site of the monastery of St. John the Little in Wadi Natrun, and that must have been an experience.
No, it was a very fortuitous event, and I only went for one season, but it was a great experience, and it was a great site to excavate.
Yeah. You also, I enjoyed reading your book chapter in this book, and your chapter is entitled The Early Islamic Period from the Arab Conquest through the Mamluk Rule, and you are also the managing editor of Coptica, and also you co-edited a book by AUC Press under the title Christianity and Monasticism in Wadi al-Natrun. Yes. So actually you are becoming a world authority in that period of critical period, which is really has been challenging for me personally, I'm sure for many Copts, which it explains the transition from Christian Egypt into the entry of the Arab conquest and Islam, and the assimilation and changing of language and culture and all of the dilemmas of that period. So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've always been kind of interested in the history of the church, first of all, and the history of the Copts. And there's always been kind of this gap in our historical conception as a community of what happens between Chalcedon and the modern era. And that's the period that I began to investigate, and I found it fascinating, as you were just saying. It's this confluence of the different languages, different cultures, and ultimately the change of the church from a church that is defined by the Greek language and the Coptic languages and its predominantly, all of Egypt being predominantly Christian, to one that is a minority tradition that is much more comfortable in Arabic, and Arabic becomes the mother language of most Copts by 10th, 11th century, 12th century, depending on whom you read. And that change, that shift over kind of from a Greco-Roman culture to one that is defined by Arabic and Islam, and how that process comes about and how that change comes about, those were the questions that kind of intrigued me, and I wanted to pursue them.
So it's a mixture of personal passion and also scientific curiosity into that period. Why did you focus on that period in particular?
Well, I mean, the book focuses on, the strict focus is about from the year roughly 600 to 900. But in order to really understand what is happening during those centuries, you have to go prior to that. In some cases, I'm going back all the way to the reign of Constantine. In other cases, proceeding forward to the 13th and 14th centuries. But that, in many ways, kind of becomes a foundational period for the church as we know it. A lot of things in the church today and the community, when you try to find their origins or how did these things begin or start, you're really looking at this time frame influenced by the ideas and the writings of the patristic fathers, which are earlier, but clearly, in many cases, what we have today is something that you would recognize in the 11th century, in the 10th century, that is inspired but not readily recognizable from what is happening in the 4th and 5th centuries.
This academically outstanding book, but also accessible to the layman, which I found it, as a layman of history and somebody interested in history, I found it very accessible and enjoyable. What topics does the book cover? I went through the list of contents and read a few pages here and there. What attracts me in particular is the chapter 5 on language, identity, and assimilation. Would you kindly enlighten us about the importance of that chapter?
Well, I mean, the way we use language, especially as Copts and within the church for the past millennium, is really beyond the means of communication. A language is first and foremost a means of communication, but we use it with a very heavy dosage of ideological underpinnings. The basic framework that we work on is that we have 3 languages and we associate certain things with each language. Coptic being Christian, being Orthodox, Greek being heretical, Arabic being Islamic. What I tried to look for as I was researching the chapter is whether or not that division actually existed, and if it didn't, how did language actually function? And as the chapter proceeds, you'll see that it really did not, our perception of language did not exist as such until roughly the 10th or 11th century. The notion that the Greek language is heretical and it's something that we abandoned at the time of Chalcedon is very, very problematic. The Greek language is used by the church in issuing official declarations and official documents and official inscriptions all the way down into the 9th and 10th centuries. We did not associate it with heresy. It was just another language that can be a medium for orthodoxy or for heresy. You know, you have to keep in mind that all of our patriarchs and our theologians and our fathers after Chalcedon, all the way until the 10th century, when they when they wrote something of theological weight internally for the church in Egypt or in communication with our brothers in Syria, they wrote it in Greek. Similarly with the Arabic language, again, the main association today and for much of the past millennium is with Islam, and there's a natural association there. The Quran is written in Arabic, it wasn't written in another language. Nonetheless, Arabic in and of itself was a Christian language before it was ever Islamic. You know, when you look at, Acts 2. Arabic is one of the languages that the Holy Spirit spoke of. You have Christian Arabic communities that are very well documented, especially in the 5th and 6th centuries prior to the rise of Islam. As it comes into Egypt, there is a bit of an ideological issue that comes in with the Arabic language, really beginning with the 10th century. When you look at how in the church and in the community, when you look at somebody who learned Arabic in the late 7th century, in the 8th century, even in the 9th century, it was dealt with in a very neutral term, in a neutral context. That person learned Arabic, or they speak with the Arabs in their tongue. It's only from the 10th century on, late 10th century on, that you start finding this very heavy ideological notion that if you're learning Arabic, that means you're becoming Islamized. That there's this accusation that you're leaving behind your religion and your identity and you're turning into something else. And that certainly was not there at the early centuries. And also with Coptic. Coptic is often referred to as the language of our fathers and the language that the Holy Spirit spoke through, which is the case. This is true. But what is left out of that discussion is that it was also the language of heretics. When you look at the Gnostics, when you look at the Manichae, when you look at every heretical sect in Egypt that wasn't in Alexandria, they're exchanging their ideas and their thought in Coptic. So the notion that Coptic is somehow a pure language, that is historically very problematic.
So this chapter, chapter 5, about identity, language, and coexistence, does it have lessons, and assimilation I meant, which in a sense there is a kind of coexistence. Does it have something useful for us today in Coptic Islamic relations in Egypt?
Well, I mean, to some extent this will depend on the eye of the beholder. In some regards, it can be a means of us reflecting upon our church and the languages that we use and the ideological significance that we place on language. It is clear that by the 10th century, 11th century on, as Arabic is becoming clearly the dominant language in Egypt, that it becomes the common medium for Christianity, for Islam, for Jews. It becomes, in many ways, the common medium. And in some ways, especially for us as the Copts, there is a lot of ideological issues that I don't get into in the book. But some of the things that kind of lead to why this period is marginalized and not real studied, so on and so forth, is, on a popular level, you'll hear individuals saying things like, well, the Arabic writings, they seem much more Quranic, or they seem much more influenced by Quranic thought. The problem there is that on one hand, it is true. On the other, we have to look at language as a medium of exchange. The other is that it kind of presents this dichotomy between Arabic and Arabic Christianity, which is infused by quote-unquote Quranic language, as opposed to the Greek fathers. The Greek fathers, all of their writings are shot through with Hellenic and Greco-Roman philosophy. All of that are the writings of pagans. So if we will use a measure to gauge the importance of Arabic Christian literature, we should be equally as critical of the patristic fathers. In both cases, the literature is important. It is part of our tradition. It has to be studied. It's unfortunate that the Arabic Christian material has been so undervalued by our community, especially us, the Copts, who wrote more Arabic Christian literature than any of our neighbors combined. But part of it is this ideological perception that the Greek fathers, they are somehow pure, and the later Arabic Christian material is somehow adulterated. The Greek fathers used the medium at their exchange, what they were educated in, the Greco-Roman classics, the pagan philosophy. When you look at theology and the number of terms that are coming from Stoic philosophy, from Neoplatonic thought, but that material is used in a Christian context. It is Christianized. Similarly, in Arabic Christian literature, you will find material that seems quote-unquote Quranic, But the importance is how is it used and how our fathers in the Middle Ages used that medium based on their education, based on what is in society, and used it in order to define Christianity and to defend Christianity.
That's in one chapter, one beautiful and interesting chapter. But you have 12 chapters. What other topics in the book the book covers?
Well, I tried... In the book, I tried to kind of look at the big picture, because as I started my research and kind of conceiving of the research project, what I want this book to be, I noticed that there's a lot of gaps, if you will, in the literature and the scholarship and the methodology. For instance, if you look at anything about Coptic church history throughout that period, and there's a lot of very good books about that topic, but most of them, overwhelming majority, you will see that they don't read or sample any Arabic Muslim authors. Okay. Yet they'll discuss something as fundamental as the conquest. It is impossible to discuss the Arab conquest and its ramifications for Egypt and the Copts without studying something or reading something as fundamental as Ibn Abd al-Hakam's Futuh Misr. That is just simply a fundamental text that has to be read in order to address that topic, and yet often that is neglected. On the other hand, oftentimes with Islamicists who are approaching Egypt in the Middle Ages and Arabic Egypt, they'll focus exclusively on Arab Muslim authors, and they will overlook the Christian material. Okay. And there, not only is that methodologically problematic because it can improve our understanding of a lot of Islamic texts, but it also feeds into a problematic conception of when does Islamic Egypt begin and what is Islamic Egypt. Conservatively, until roughly the year 1000, numerically it is the Christians, the Copts, who are the majority in Egypt. The beginning of Islam all the way through the Umayyad Caliphate, the Muslims were probably a very small minority within Egypt. Yet when you read a book about Egypt in the Middle Ages, it is Muslim authors who are privileged to the exclusion of Christian sources and the like. And in my study, just kind of from the very get-go, I wanted to remedy that problem, that gap. And hence, I'm looking at Christian authors, I'm looking at Islamic authors, I'm reading Syrian authors, any text that can have a bearing on that period, on what is happening in Egypt at that time, I try to get my hands on and to read.
You started this research for your PhD dissertation at UCLA, which you graduated 2004.
Yes.
And I was delighted and proud that your PhD dissertation received the best mention or best
honorable mention.
Honorable mention by the Middle Eastern Studies Association of the next year.
Thank you.
And congratulations on that recognition.
Oh, thank you.
And then you expanded your research since then to produce this book. And where did you find all of these resources? At UCLA Library and or other places around America or?
Everywhere from the UCLA Library. The St. Jude Society here in Southern California has tremendous holdings.
Yeah.
The interlibrary loan system, the beauty of the American educational system is that if it's a book that you want and any other library within the U.S. has it, it's a matter of a few days to maybe a week or two, and they'll be able to bring it to you. So by drawing on all of these resources, I was able to get most of what I wanted to read through.
And I know you taught Greek New Testament at the Coptic Orthodox Seminary in Los Angeles. One of your students.
One of the courses, yes.
One of those. One of the courses that you taught was. So you had to be capable in reading Greek, Arabic, English, Coptic. What else?
Well, it kind of comes with the territory, with the study. Anyone's dealing with the earlier material, you're dealing with multiple languages. I wouldn't claim to be extremely proficient in any of them, but I can make my way through a text.
What topics has the most interest to you personally in this book?
I mean, there are several of them. In some regards, the book also deals with the Islamic community and how the Islamic community changes, because initially, they're coming in as warriors, as soldiers, and at some point, they transition into farmers, and the book kind of details that. And within 2 centuries, the Arabs' descendants of the first conquerors, they're no longer in the administration of the army; they're being replaced by Turks, Persians, and various other ethnic groups, and that transition was of interest. On the Coptic side, there are several things. There's one slightly quirky topic in there that deals with time and how we conceive of time and which calendars we used, because it kind of fed into a real problem with all of the calendars that were in use prior to the conquest. They were based on the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, and how many years they've been ruling, so on and so forth. And after the Arab Conquest, you don't have an emperor. Also there, it's the beginning of the era of the martyrs calendar, which, unfortunately in a lot of popular literature, it's projected all the way back to Diocletian. But we don't really begin to use the title, the era of the martyrs, till about the second half of the 9th century, and it's not very prevalent until the 11th century. Other things have to do with, the decline of Alexandria in some respects in the ecclesiastical sphere, and the rise of Fustat and later on Cairo, and the dynamics and the intrigue that went back and forth between the 2 seas, and eventually kind of the process. It's a long process, at the end of which the Patriarchate finally relocates to Cairo. And even then, it takes several generations for the Patriarch to be in charge of Cairo. As you know, Cairo and Misr had its own bishop, all the way through to till at least Cyril II, and really had it until Gabriel ibn Turik came into power.
I read in the book. Sorry. I read in the book about the Bishop of Cairo, or Fustat, who often was problematic to the Patriarch in Alexandria during this period. And one of them is at the time of Pope Yusuf I. And I was surprised and unhappy to read the details here, but also the Synaxarium. Last Sunday in the church, we were listening to it, but the Synaxarian mentions it in a spiritual message, while the book here gives the details of the political game the Bishop of Cairo, well, it was not Cairo at the time.
It was Tanis and the Bishop of Cairo.
Bishop of Tanis and Bishop of what is now Cairo.
Misr,
Misr, the Bishop of Misr. Was causing the Patriarch because of the bishop's relationship with the ruler in Misr. So that's an unhappy chapter, right?
It's an unhappy chapter, but from long ago, before I even thought about going into history as a profession and doing my degree and so on and so forth, just as an amateur historian, as somebody who read, I just firmly believe that history teaches. But in order for history to teach, you have to listen to it honestly. History teaches good when it's good, when it's bad, even when it's ugly. It is still teaching. And it's important not to cover up problematic issues or things of that nature, because then you deprive history from its didactic, educational role. That passage is not one of the great glories in of the.
Well, even the Synaxarian does not deny it. It explains a little, but it has to be read in 10 minutes at the most. So it's a short version. Here you find the long version, and I was delighted not to hear the bad news, but delighted that you covered from many sources all aspects of the story. And these are great lessons of history. We're coming to a conclusion. Would you kindly give us a last word about your current and future projects that you have in mind about history or writing for history?
Well, currently there are 2 chapters that are coming out. One on, they're dealing with the history of fast within the church, the history of Lent within Alexandria and within the church, and the history of the fast of the apostles. The project that's kind of beginning to occupy me more and more kind of deals with Christian saints, Coptic saints in the Middle Ages, and the shrines and the locations that become shared with Muslims, and how the traditions begin to fuse and to inform both communities. You know, for some, in some cases, it didn't have a huge effect, but especially the traditions dealing with the Holy Family, those did impact Muslims, and a lot of the sites kind of became shared sites between the Copts and the Muslim, both of them recognizing certain locations as spiritually important, as signposts for Christ in Egypt.
Wow. I would like to invite the viewers to even Google if you have any interest in a particular topic of that period, and also a little before and centuries before and centuries after. You can even Google it and see if sometime in the future Google Books can give you 1 page as a sample of this book. And now I would like to thank you, Deacon Severus Mikhail, for kindly and graciously enlightening us with knowledge about this important critical period in the history of Egypt and the history of the Copts.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Hope to see you again in our program, Coptic Civilization.
Thank you.
And our viewers, thank you for watching Logos TV, our program Coptic Civilization. See you next week in another segment of this program.